Welcome, welcome. It's Soul Mastery for the soul-led entrepreneur who desires it all, purpose, power, and profits. I am your host, Jaitali Desai, business and success mentor to many. I am skilled at helping you build and scale your business using the lens of human design, hypnosis, and other energetic strategies to increase not only your income, but your impact. And today, I am all about female leadership. The more women we have standing in their power will change the dynamic of not only business, but I think a society as a whole. And today I have one of my colleagues and good friends, Shana Francesca. She's going to come on and guys, you're going to want to take notes because we are talking intentional leadership and let's get after it. Shana, welcome on. I'm so excited to have you.
Thanks for having me, Tali. I'm so excited to be here and have this conversation with you.
And I cannot wait to get into it. But before we even get started, I would love to hear from you, for our listeners, who you are, what do you do, how did you get started, and then let's get into this because I think it's a beautiful backstory and one that's relevant to what we're talking about today.
Yeah, agreed. Yeah. So thanks again for having me. My name is Shana Francesca. I'm a scholar of intentional and ethical leadership and living. And I got there because I grew up in an abusive household, and my parents joined an evangelical Christian cult when I was a child. And so was raised up in that environment. And so I got to see from the inside, what does intentionally harmful, unethical leadership look like, both inside my own home and in my more public life. Can't really call it public life because basically my whole life was enveloped inside of this cult. So I went to school there 5 days a week. We went to church 3 times a week. The only day of a week that I wasn't consistently on the premises was Saturdays. And sometimes that was also not, we would still be there on Saturdays because there was plays that we were rehearsing and so on and so forth. They would put on massive plays where there was like 200 of us in the cast. So there's a lot of rehearsing. There's like huge chunks of times of the year where, I was there every single day and every waking moment was encapsulated within this organization. And so my life in whole was encompassed abuse, trauma, sexual abuse, child slavery, or child labor, not child slavery, but child labor. Knowing that I had no advocates, knowing that when I would call attention to the things that were harming me, I would be dismissed. My pain would be diminished. It would not be taken seriously. Who I was not allowed to show up as myself. I was instead required to show up in the ways that the people around me decided was good and right. And who I was not allowed to take up space. And so it's no shock that my work in life has led me to what is it to be an intentional and ethical human? Because the place I've gotten through this journey is that we are not raised to be human. We are not raised to be a part of nature, to recognize that we are nature and that we are meant to be stewards of all life. We are instead raised to survive within capitalism and within systems of oppression and within hierarchy. Constantly trying to vie for a position within that hierarchy in order to secure our survival, which is fundamentally inhumane and feels a lot like, what was that movie? The Hunger Games,
Oh, yeah.
And that is all too many people's absolute reality, right?
Right.
Like fundamentally, right? Like we know historically that specific, when Black people have gotten together, recognizing that their humanity is not honored and created their own ecosystems, their own economies, and bubbles of life within within our system, they've been systematically bombed, harmed, dismantled. So literally, when I say literally the Hunger Games, I really mean it. And so my work aims for us as human beings to recognize what is it to be intentional and ethical? How do we build community so that we can actually realize how powerful we are? Because we are not powerful. We are powerful individually, right? But it's actually
collectively.
Correct. It's actually in the collective that power is realized. And then to recognize, what is it to lead what is it to lead community? What is it to be leadership? What is it to recognize that there's no such thing as a lonely leader at a top, that that's not leadership, that's exploitation and colonization. And
Oh, wait,
right,
go back a second and say it again.
there's no such thing as a lonely leader at the top, right? In that scenario, it is not leadership, it is exploitation and colonization.
Damn, that's deeper than I was expecting us to get. Let's get after this, though.
Right. So that's my work.
Yeah, okay. So Shana and I met at a conference, actually,
Yeah.
and we were sitting there and we just connected,
Yeah.
right? And I will be very honest, this aspect of your story we didn't even touch on. So watching you, because I'm a fifth line in human design, I observe everything. That
Yeah.
is my thing. I see how things move, operate, all that, right? That and just of my human nature.
Yeah.
I would never in a million years have guessed that that was your background, that that is your story.
Yeah.
So let's dive into that, because I think it's directly related into the oppression and the colonization and the central focus of a single leader is not actual the leader. Because
Right.
that's probably the first time I've heard it put this way.
Yeah. Yeah.
So you had to walk, we've all probably seen shows where people leave cults, but that process is not easy, to say the least.
No.
And to step out of that and to rebuild yourself, specifically you, in the manner that I have observed, that's powerful. Can you share a little bit of that backstory? I'm not sure if that's a part of what you usually talk about.
Sure. I think it's important that people recognize that oftentimes when you're in a cult, you don't realize you're in a cult.
Right, because it seems normal, right?
It seems normal. The patterns of harmful behavior have been normalized. When I left that environment, I left by myself. It wasn't like my family came with me. And the dynamic in my life was that when my parents joined that cult, and by the way, cults tend to be magnets for harmful people, right? So for like abusive people. And so my father joined that organization and brought us with him because he was already a deeply harmful person. And that harm was completely normalized and acceptable within that organization.
Dynamic. Yeah.
Right. So we had been really cut off from our extended family, right? It was just our immediate family. The rest of our family was either not really all that religious or was not part of evangelical Christianity at all. As a matter of fact, both of my parents' background is Catholicism. They grew up Catholic. And so there was nobody else in the family who was connected to this. They saw it as extreme. They did not like my father at all. He ensured that he cut us off from any support or community to be able to leave him or leave this community. And I say all of that to say that when I left, the exit costs were significant because it was the only real community, even though it wasn't authentic, healthy community. It was the only community I had ever known. It was the only place I had ever existed, right?
Yeah.
And I didn't have friends outside of it, really. I didn't. I lived in a neighborhood, 15 minutes away, but I wasn't connected to the people in my neighborhood because I wasn't allowed to play with other kids, like secular people. By the way, there's always a name for people outside of your cult.
Okay.
Like that's one of the ways you can tell you're in a cult is if there's names for things that exist outside of that cult. So I wasn't allowed to spend time with secular people. Or secular music or secular artistry or anything like that would in fact expand my worldview. And so leaving that environment was deeply frightening to me. I had been taught to fear everything around me. I had been taught that everyone around me was choosing to live an evil life and they were going to hell. I was taught that if I left that environment, I was going to hell. I was taught that would make me a bad person, a sinner, somebody who was pursuing only self-pleasure and was, just evil and possessed or, a tool of the devil, right? And so there was a lot of fear mongering and there was a lot that I had to overcome mentally to leave that environment. And so leaving, I left entirely by myself. Even my immediate family didn't leave. So I left and I started going to another church, which turned out to be following the same pattern of behavior. And then I went to another one who had ended up following the same pattern of behavior. And then I was like, oh, wait a second. It's the ideology that leads you absolutely here. This is where it's always going to lead. But leaving your entire community, all of your family, and striking out on your own to try to forge a life for yourself when you've been taught to be afraid of everything is a massive exit cost, right? Yes. It's not that I had to pay anybody money, but my entire life I was walking away from my entire life, and that is a deeply frightening place to be. And so when you make that choice, you really have no choice but to rebuild a life, or you literally won't survive. Like, we as human beings can't survive on our own. My mental health would have deteriorated even further. And so I turned to books as mentors, and I started crafting community around myself, around learning. That I knew I had a lot of learning to do, and I had spent most of my life trying to access understanding of the world through books, but I just wasn't allowed access to ones that would actually contradict the world
what you were being taught.
Correct. Yeah.
So building community around books, what does that mean?
Books are beautiful things. Yeah. They are the stories of the lived experiences of people whose perspectives are different than our own, whose lived experiences are different than our own. Our perspective of the world, our way of viewing the world, is ours and ours alone. No one else in the world views the world the way we do. And so when we gain access to the stories of the lived experiences and the wisdom of other people, it takes our chunk of a worldview and shows us a reflection of someone else's, right? Books became the mentors in my head. Books became the feeder for my curiosity. They stoked that fire in a really incredible way. And I just want to take this moment to say, anyone who is denying access to knowledge, who is trying to ban books, is not doing so to help people. They are doing so to harm people and to control the narrative, which is always a deeply scary thing to do. And I want to take a further step back and say, if you have children and you don't want your children to read specific books, you have all of the right in the world to not allow your children access to those books. However, to deny other people access to that education is fundamentally the proof positive that you are interested in control and you are interested in manipulation. Yeah. You are not interested in the preservation of people's humanity and autonomy.
Well, you say that, and people listening are maybe not realizing that it's an actual issue right now in the U.S.
Yes, and by the way, I live in New Jersey, and in New Jersey, I've been speaking to librarians. I was at an ACLU New Jersey event just a couple of weeks ago where a librarian was making it very plain, and I've spoken to other librarians since, and people involved in my county's library, board of the library, the people who support the library, that there are people actively trying to ban whole swaths of books. Yeah. And I grew up in an environment where there were no gay people, right? And I'm saying that with air quotes for those of you who aren't watching. There was no discussion of being gay. There was no sex education around that. And yet, people I grew up with are very, very gay. So denying access to knowledge of the lived experience of what it is to be gay does not stop people from being gay.
Right.
It just makes it easier to manipulate, control, and harm them. And so that's why I will always come back to the fact that the denial of knowledge is fundamentally an indication of unethical behavior.
Yeah, it's for all marginalized people, and I'm going to put women in this category also for this context. We forget that as women, we in the US were just allowed bank accounts.
Correct.
In the 60s. Without the permission of your husband.
In my mother's lifetime. My mom was born in 1961.
Yeah. And so, it's so easy to disassociate.
Yeah.
And say, oh, it happened back then. back then is relative.
Back then is in our lived lifetime.
Exactly. And it's the same concept for minorities, for those of the LGBTQ
Plus,
plus.
yeah.
Thank you. And that experience for so many people, they've disassociated it in trying to say that it's not real, right? You
Yeah.
just think you are. I think the whole conversation and that dynamic is a whole different. It's a cult, but without being a cult.
Oh, no, it is. So there's a friend of mine who I'm connected to on TikTok who's a scholar of cults, and
Oh,
she's actually writing a book right now called The Culting of America. And she is proposing that any community of people is on a cult spectrum, and that at some point they cross over to being from culture to a cult. And I don't know that she's establishing a specific moment where that happens, but in my work I propose that we slip from an ethical culture to unethical culture and into what she would call that cult spectrum the minute that we are no longer invested in curiosity, respect, and accountability.
well, I think that topic, those concepts, they're far reaching because it's not just
Far reaching.
like that is applicable to any aspect of life, right? So then
Yes.
how from a leadership standpoint do you start to say enough and here's how we change, or this is the time to change and here's
Yeah.
step one.
I mean, this is the time to change, right? This is the time to change right
Right.
now. The time to change was a long time ago,
Yeah,
but
when it
in the
started, but
absence of a long time ago, we have now, right? And that's all we have to work with. And so when I'm thinking about when I'm having discussions with leaders or when I'm delivering a keynote or whatever it is, when we're having these discussions, is the remembrance that curiosity is something I think we were born with.
100%, that's how kids learn.
And it is programmed out of us through what I call the industrialization of human beings in order to serve hierarchy, systems of oppression, and capitalism.
Yeah.
Human beings are the only beings that have to pay to survive, right? All of the beings on this planet work and collect and participate with one another in sharing resources. We paywall them, right? All of the things required for our basic survival are hidden behind a paywall, which is, to me, fundamentally inhumane if you don't give people fundamental basic income, right? If people aren't guaranteed survival, right? They didn't have
Right.
any choice in coming here. No human being I've ever met had a choice in being brought here. And yet we're denying the resources necessary for their survival and then saying, no, you've got to pull yourself up by your bootstraps. Meanwhile, we haven't given them boots or straps.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's really deeply important that leaders understand that their people cannot have and dedicate the mental space necessary to contribute to their company's thriving when they themselves, as human beings, as beings on this planet, are not also thriving.
Oh, yeah. So this is a great time to talk
Yeah.
about this. Right now in the country, in the States, we're going through childcare reformation.
Yeah. The air quotes. I'm laughing because the air quotes and I know what you mean, but I'm like,
Right? Like, how do you expect a woman? Because typically, I mean,
we're
at the end of the day, women are going to stand and say, "This is my child. I will do what I have to do." Right? We've all heard the
right.
stories. We've all
Yeah.
experienced it.
Yeah.
Whatever.
Or we can also say people with uteruses to be inclusive.
Okay.
Yeah.
Fair.
Yeah.
Fair. My goal wasn't to be not inclusive,
No,
but I
I
didn't think
know.
about it
That's
that
why I was
way.
like, let me just clarify for anybody listening. I want to make sure everybody feels included.
Yeah, no, 100%. So when you're going to work and now childcare reformation is up on the table and saying, well, we just can't afford it. What is the expectation? Like, I think this is the only country where this is an issue.
Well, yeah, the first
That and along with our healthcare, but that's a whole different beast.
well, I don't know that it's a whole different piece. I think they're one and the same. I think our fundamental lack of providing, again, food, water, clean air, right? And not just water, but drinkable water, clean,
Yeah.
healthy, drinkable water, clean, healthy air. Those things, those qualifiers are necessary.
Sadly, yeah.
And that's the horrifying part, is those qualifiers are necessary. And by the way, we're fed from the land, right? And
Yeah.
so our lack of caring for the land means our own death.
Right.
Our own unhealth comes as a result of the lack of health, the lack of our investment in the health of the land that we are fed from, and our lack of recognition that it is also life to be honored. But here's the question that I ask leaders is, and this is, starting out entrepreneurs, I understand that's a very different thing, right? And that's kind of a different conversation, and we'll get to that. But what I ask leaders, well-established companies, right? What can you afford? What are you affording? Where is your money going? Where is it being spent? Right? Because if it's your profits and your shareholders over the people who are making it possible for you to have a company and a product to sell, that's fundamentally inhumane. And there has to be a shift in that, right? And there's lots of leaders that I've talked to who have ended up shifting, not lots, but there's several who, in talking to them, we've recognized the value of profit sharing, of maybe moving towards an ESOP, right, which is an employee-owned, even in part or a whole. You can be like 50% ESOP, so on and so forth. And there are companies and things that they can look to understand how to build a more ethical way of being in business, right? There are companies you can study, leaders that you can study, right, who have understood that they have to invest in their people to be humane. When it comes to entrepreneurs and small business owners, and expanding business owners like myself, it comes to, how do you honor your people's humanity? Can you pay them at least what minimum wage would be, right? Because minimum wage adjusted for inflation is $25 an hour. Can you insist on paying your interns, right, rather than looking them as free labor? Because interns are people too, and they still have to pay to live. Right. And so it's a matter of us rethinking the way that we look at the way we invest in other human beings, and then saying, hey, are there other things that I can provide, resources I can connect my people to, benefits where they can use the company cards, miles, to go on vacation, to pay for their flights for vacation, or so on and so forth, right? There's ways that we can share resources in creative ways, that show and demonstrate that even as a budding business owner or a small business owner, that you are deeply invested in honoring your people at the highest level.
Right. I'm taking it all in and like processing it as we're talking about it. So you'll have to excuse the pause here. But some of our listeners are in their early stages of entrepreneurship. So
Yeah.
where do they fall in this, in the support system, in creating the support for this kind of ethical pathway, is kind of how I see it, right?
Yeah. Again, I think it's a matter of getting curious, of respecting and honoring your people, of not putting yourself hierarchically above your people, recognizing that you need them that you need them to help build your business, and honoring that relationship, and starting from that place.
So putting people over profits.
Yeah, well, it's like, even, right? It's like, I know you need the profit to be able to pay your people,
Right.
but when I'm saying profit over people, I mean that, like, profit that you're taking, like, if you're taking early in entrepreneurship, you're not making any money. So I'm not proposing that
Right.
you starve to death while your people are paid.
Yeah.
Right? There's a balance there, right? Which is why I'm saying, let's get creative about the things that you can offer your people that won't actually cost you money. You could incentivize your people and say, hey, any client that you bring in, will, depending on your business model, they'll get a commission. It could be anywhere from 10 to 50%, right? Being able to connect with, honoring people's contribution directly, right? And so that motivates them. And my now policy, when I first started out, was 10% because I couldn't afford to give people any larger of a chunk. Because I was also paying them hourly, right? So like that's the other thing to take into consideration is, if they bring in a client, what is the pay structure like? And this is important when you don't have employees, when they're contractors, right?
Right.
So if it's a contractor, okay, then we can split the profit 50-50. Then you're not getting paid hourly on that client. You're splitting that profit evenly with me, so on and so forth. There becomes this back and forth of, is there different nuanced ways that we can interact with the company, with one another, with clients, that honors your contribution and my own?
Okay, that's fair, because I think for so many, we're asking them to look at business in a new way.
Yeah.
And again, capitalism is what everyone knows.
Yeah. And we have
Whether
to play that game, whether we like it or not, in some way,
correct,
shape, or form. Yeah.
correct. So we want it to be actually applicable, because that's one of the key elements of this podcast. I want people to be able to walk away and be like, okay, I can start this step today, or I
Yeah.
can shift this, right? And so what I like about this is that it, one, opens up to different business models.
Yeah.
Especially for those who do have contractors.
Yeah.
You can get creative where it still works for everybody. Hourly pay, there could be some kind of bonus that maybe you've never even thought about, because you're like, oh, I'm a small business person.
Right.
First of all, I think taking small out of the equation is huge,
Yes.
because our words matter. So you get to be a business owner, period. And once you sit in that seat, I think it really shifts the way we see our business.
Yeah.
And the trickle-down economics of it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Where I'm really curious is for women who are listening. Where do they start in their own communities? Is it through self-education, through books? Is it finding some kind of leadership collective? Like, what does that look like?
Yes, to all those things. I think your own journey is going to be your own journey. What you're ready and prepared for, and how you're ready and prepared to show up, is how you're going to show up in the world. And that's what you're going to attract to yourself. Yes, look for, groups that are women-led business owners. I would definitely recommend 2 books. I think they speak to our understanding of who we are as human beings and how to build community and honor all life. I would recommend How We Show Up by Mia Birdsong, and Braiding Sweetgrass by Robin Wall Kimmerer. And then I would continue your learning, continue building on that. Understand the world around you in deeper ways that challenge your current view and understanding. And in so doing, you then get to be able to show up and build community around yourself that is ethical, because then you're better able to show up more ethically in the world, right? You can't build ethical community around yourself if you don't understand in what ways you've been programmed to normalize harm, right? Like our consumerist focused, consumption focused society has normalized the harm of producing all of those goods, right? And it doesn't mean we can stop consuming it, because virtually everything we consume is produced almost guaranteed unethically. But it does mean that we can start to be conscious of how we're purchasing. It can be conscious of the use of those things. We can be conscious of the labor used to produce those things. We can just start to show up in different ways. And as we start to get curious about the world around us and how we could better interact with it, and how we could mitigate our own harm, and live in reciprocity with the world around us, right? Giving and taking in equal measure, which Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about in depth in Braiding Sweetgrass, then I think we get to show up more ethically and be more intentional, right? Because intentionality without an understanding of what it is to be ethical leads us further towards harm. So it's really deeply important that we understand the living world around us, our participation in it, and are here to stand up for harm against all life. Period.
Yeah. And I think it's important to share, you said it earlier, but like we live on a living, breathing planet,
Yes.
right? So understanding how our life directly impacts the earth and then which is also feeding us. So there's that whole cycle that needs to be put on the table.
Right. And it's not currently on the table. It's not. We've been disconnected from that.
Yeah, 100%. But I think it's interesting at this point, farm to table is becoming like a trend,
Yeah.
which, it's a trend. I get it. But at least it's bringing the conversation up.
Yeah, it
And
is.
hopefully it does expand. But for those who do have like local farmers markets, this is one of those spaces where you as a consumer get to be intentional, get to be in that more quote unquote ethical space.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I think not to get too micro into this, but I think farming in general, our understanding of farming has to change because
Yeah.
currently, like monoculture is emphatically harmful. The growing of a singular plant in massive amounts of acreage and fields is fundamentally harmful. It does not create reciprocity between the soil and the plants. And most people don't know that soil is full of millions and billions of organisms. Each handful is alive, right? And it's the fact that it's alive and that it has all these organisms that are functioning together, these bacteria, these organisms, that in fact contribute to and feed the plants that grow from it, except we kill it. We kill the soil with herbicides and pesticides, and then we put fertilizer, quote unquote, into the soil that is made from petroleum. So we are fundamentally making our food that grows from it unhealthy. It actually, in growing a singular plant, lowers production of any food gathering, right? It lowers its health. I mean, it also makes it easier to wipe out an entire crop because any kind of pestilence that heads its way and finds it is going to wipe out an entire, because it's going to be like, oh, this is all the thing we love to eat, right? So it makes it more susceptible. There are other ways of growing food, including food forests and including permaculture practices that work with the soil, and the plants are grown together that work with one another and live in reciprocity with each other. It's again understanding that we are part of an ecosystem. Nature, this earth is an ecosystem made up of smaller ecosystems, and to grow our food in a way that builds on the health of that ecosystem is what leads to our own health.
That is, I think that's it right there. There's so much more to consider.
Yeah.
But I think it starts with conversations like this and
Yes.
bringing it to the proverbial table.
Yes. Agreed.
I know we can continue down this rabbit hole because that is exactly what it is. In order to course correct, we will have to go down this path.
Yeah.
For listeners, though, today who are like, okay, I need to know more from Shana, how can they get in touch with you?
Yeah, absolutely. So my website is a great way to get in touch with me. My contact information is there. It's www.consonate.world, and I'm sure it will be tagged in the show notes, but it's CONCINNATE.world. You could also email me at shana@consonate.world. But also check out, there's a lot of great information on my website. We're in the process of updating it at the this year. So the end of this year. So over the next few weeks, you'll see some new videos popping up, some new free information, some updated resources. There's also information about me as a speaker, and I host workshops through my website. There's a condensed version of both of my workshops available through the website because I really believe in the democratization of information. So for small business owners, I want them to be able to access this. Each workshop comes with a 30+ page workbook that helps you to implement these ideas that we're discussing. So it's really important, and they're $45 for a 45-minute workshop with a Q&A at the end, and you get a workbook to take with you. So I really want this to be as accessible as possible to people.
Oh, I love that. Thank you so much. Shana, this has been very eye-opening, way more in-depth than I even anticipated. And thank you for sharing your story, because I know it's going to resonate with so many of our listeners today. And to know that at the end of the day, is knowing that there's hope.
Yeah. Agreed.
right? And
There's
that they are not alone, because oftentimes we sit in a space we know is not for us because we don't know that there's someone else that has maybe been through this or that can understand.
yeah,
And
yeah.
in this day and time, with social media, with internet, we can find support.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's despair in individuality, right? In not in like no, not individuality. There's despair in our hyper individualization, right? In thinking we have to go it alone and that no one else understands. There's power and support in community. There's beautiful ways we can move forward and undo the harm we've caused and then mitigate the harm moving forward. But really there's just so much beauty in community, so much support. People around us work as mirrors and help us to see and understand and expand and grow our reach. Like you and I, we became community when we sat next to each other and had this beautiful conversation. There's serendipitous moments everywhere in our life if we're looking for them and open to them. And it's really important to find those and really connect with the people around us.
That was beautiful. Thank you. Well, I am Chaitali Desai, and this is Shana Francesca, and we are wishing you all a beautiful day. Definitely check the show notes so you can get in touch with Shana, and we would love for you to tag us on social and share with us your favorite takeaway from today, because this is how we create the movement forward and build community. So we're looking forward to that. And again, we're wishing you a beautiful day, and remember, the time is now.